My name is Vance Aloupis, and I have the honor and privilege of being the CEO of the Children's Movement of Florida. I've been with this organization since its inception in 2010. And this is actually my first time being a part of the Bosses for Babies chats that we're doing on Facebook. And I have one of my favorite people in the world, CEO of the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Mark Wilson, joining us today. Mark, thank you so much for being here, my friend.
Yeah, Vance, listen, thank you, and I appreciate everything the children's movement does. This is an incredibly important time in America, and as you and I work together to try to set the pace for the rest of the country, I think there's no more important group than our children and their parents. And I know it's an overused word, these are unprecedented times, but I really appreciate the platform today for us to have a discussion about pathways forward, and I know we're going to talk about Bosses for Babies today, which is an incredibly important new initiative.
Yeah, I'll tell a little story because people really don't know the history of Mark and my relationship. It was probably Mark. I'm trying to think. It was probably 6 or 7 years ago when our board chair Dave Lawrence called you because we were thinking about doing an event in Tallahassee with the governor, who was Rick Scott at the time, and it was going to be a conversation with the business community around early childhood. And Tony Carvajal, who's now a member of our board and the CEO of the Able Trust, I remember he was on the call. And I love you, but I think there was always, you weren't quite evangelized on the issue yet. And, you listened to Dave, and Dave is extremely persuasive and said, Mark, we'd really like your help engaging business leaders to come to this lunch and listen to one of the foremost neuroscientists in the world on early brain development. And you said, okay, we'll help. And we ended up packing, the Doak Campbell conference room with over 200 business leaders. The governor came, and you were central in that success. And really, from that point, and I don't say this lightly, you have become, to use the word again, and you've heard me say this, you've become evangelical on this issue. And I tell people all the time, I'm an advocate. When I walk into the room, they know that I'm going to talk about, early childhood education. They know that that's my passion. But when you come into the room, you're coming in representing the business interests, the economic interests of Florida. And for you to talk about issues of early education, health access, prosperity, I mean, you are a very, very powerful messenger, on this issue. And I'm so grateful for your friendship, and equally so, I'm so grateful that you have dug in so deep on this issue, because I believe this to my core. I believe it's going to be the business community that wins the day on early childhood. The advocates, myself, we will be there to help, but it's going to be the business community insisting on change.
Yeah, and Vance, I love when you tell that story, because it seems like it was 10 minutes ago, but the reality of it was years ago. And I think what's important for everyone that's watching or listening in today to sort of take from that experience is, here we had the children's movement, which was, clearly, if not the number one group in the country, certainly a leadership group that the rest of the country looks to provide solutions for early learning. And we're so lucky to have you and Dave Lawrence in that capacity. But Vance, I think the rest of that story is, I think many of us in Florida, certainly in the business community, were under the misperception, I should say, that, somebody else has this. Right? Like it's great that Dave Lawrence was out there, and Dave's a great guy. He's providing great leadership, and we're glad somebody's taking care of it, and sure glad Dave's on the case. The more I got involved and the more business leaders became involved, you start looking at the data. You talked about we talk about brain science and how important it is. It's irrefutable. But when you consider that, at the time, Florida is going to grow by 4.5 million more people between, now and 2030. We're going to have, 4 million more kids under 6 between now and 2030. When you start looking, when you talk about children's issues, I think a light bulb goes off that says, wait, an investment in children is an investment in all of us, right? It's not just the child or their family. These are future workers, right? These are the people that are going to make our economy work in another 15 or 20 years. And so the moment you look at all the data, all the analysis, all the research, this isn't someone else's priority. This is all of our priority. And so whatever we can do to raise awareness that this is all of our opportunity. That was my aha moment, and I'll forever be grateful to Dave and for you for putting that opportunity in front of us.
You were easier to convince than others, so thank you. Tony, we really had to work on him. It was really tough, but so one of the things that you and I have talked about is talking about the workforce of today and the workforce of tomorrow. Obviously, the workforce of 2030, which is a point in Florida's future that you and I care deeply about, and it's what the Florida Chamber Foundation is singularly focused on. And we talk about how the students going into fourth grade next year are that 2030 workforce, and how are we preparing for them. But I guess my first question for you is, we've talked a lot about the impact of COVID on childcare. And, in my community, in Miami-Dade County, we got to a point where 80% of childcare was closed. And it's begun to reopen more out of necessity than anything else. There are still challenges that we're seeing with health and safety, but statewide, at least half, close to 60% of childcare is closed. What impact did you see that have on the economy, and what are your projections as we continue to move through phase one and phase two?
Yeah, so Vance, that's a big question, and so let me give a little bit of perspective on that. I'm blessed to be the national chair right now of the National Association of State Chambers of Commerce, and I'm also part of the U.S. Chamber's leadership. And I only say that to say, twice a week I'm on a 1-hour Zoom call. Once is with 50 state chamber presidents, and the other is with the top 100 chambers across America. There's not a call that we have where childcare doesn't come up on the call. Early on, the concern was these are incredibly important small businesses. They're essential services across the country. What can all of us do to try to help them stay in business, right? So it first was about the childcare facilities and the workers themselves. As time went on, we quickly all realized that this is also a workforce crisis, because if we can't keep our childcare facilities afloat, then what's going to happen when people eventually go back to work, right? And, just in Florida alone, I think we have about 1.5 million kids, who are in this current, bucket that we have. About 2/3 of them have parents. They're either in a single parent household or they work. And so, what are we going to do with potentially millions of kids who, we want to help kids learn and get the support they need. But here in the next couple of weeks and months, we have over 1 million people in Florida who are unemployed. And as people start, getting called back, we have layers of a crisis on our hands. And so, our chief economist, Dr. Jerry Parrish, continues to give us projections about what might happen in our economy. And the reality of it is, without a vaccine, in the near-term horizon, 3, 4, 5, 6 months from now is not going to look much different in terms of our daily challenges than what we're wrestling with right now. And if we can't all come together to figure out how to support our kids and our child care facilities, we're going to have sort of another wave of impact that I don't think many people outside the industry see coming.
Yeah, no, and I know you know this, and I think it's just important to tell everybody that's watching. The complexity of this issue is very real, and I think that's been part of our shared frustration. Is that early childhood is oftentimes an afterthought in the larger conversation about education or education reform. And what I've seen from my conversations with childcare providers is the guidelines that are being put in place, which are explicitly for health and safety, are limiting the size of the classrooms. And if a childcare facility does not have extra space or can't partition a room, their attendance is being cut in half. And the industry as well as I do. These are small, the vast majority are small businesses, and they can't operate, their margins that they're operating on are very, very thin. So to cut their attendance in half basically puts them in a place where they are essentially going to go out of business at some point. And I guess my question for you in that context, where you're trying to balance the health and safety with the financial viability of a small business, are you hearing anything from across the country that gives you any hope that there is a clear plan for this?
Yeah, Vance, I think, look, there's two issues to look at there, right? I think first, I think what's important to look at is, Congress right now is working on phase 4, which is likely to be at least a $1 trillion stimulus package. We were one of the first groups in the country, the Florida Chamber was, to sign on to the U.S. Chamber's effort, to have child care facilities included in the next couple of rounds of stimulus. Because, look, it is government policy to shut down parts of our economy. And so it's through no fault of a child care facility that they are going to have fewer kids or no kids coming through. It's certainly not their fault at all. It's actually a result of government policy of either shutdowns or partial shutdowns. And so it stands to reason that it would be very smart on behalf of our policymakers to make those child care facilities whole, because they're so essential, right? Whether you want to look at it from the development of our kids and our future workers and future citizenry, or looking at it from actually getting America back to work again, it makes complete sense that our government would provide support for essential services known as child care facilities. And we were an early signer onto that from a federal policy standpoint. Obviously, we hope Florida will continue to do all that it can at the state and at the county level as well. But Vance, I know, you and I, sometimes talk politics because, Florida is the most important state in the country from a political standpoint. And I think we need to acknowledge, there's an election for the White House, and we're not going to talk about that today. I didn't come on here to talk politics, but, we just did a statewide poll recently, the Florida Chamber did, and we asked a question, which is, do you think Florida's handling the coronavirus response the right way? Are we opening too soon, or are we going too slow? And I think it's important, Vance, to acknowledge that 68% of Democrats in Florida think that we're going too fast and that we're not handling this the right way. But at the same time, Vance, exactly 68% of Republicans think we're handling it exactly the right way and that we're going about it, in the right fashion. And so when you have the exact same fact pattern playing out in front of us, but 68% of people think it's good or bad based on their party affiliation, all of us in the child care industry and in the business community, we need to come up with some private sector solutions that sort of can pierce through this hyper-partisanship that we have. And we need to be advocating the right policies, but also what you've come up with Bosses for Babies, for an example, that's a private sector initiative. And if we can get thousands of companies engaging in their own solutions at the company level, then think about how many millions of people we can impact without waiting on the federal government to do that, so to speak. So sorry for the long answer, but pretty passionate about it.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask you about Bosses for Babies, but before I do that, what I think is fascinating about this is for so long as advocates, we've tried to steer the narrative of early childhood away from the workforce of today, right? For a long time in Florida, the early childhood programs were under the Agency for Workforce Innovation, AWI, previously, the former, what is now DEO. And it was seen as a program that ensured that people could go to work. And we worked really, really hard to try and change people's perspective on the fact that, yes, it's about people going to work today, but it really is about building that future workforce and giving children that foundation. I find myself now in my capacity as CEO of the Children's Movement, fighting for both workforces, the workforce of today and the workforce of tomorrow, which has not been part of my narrative for the last 10 years. But I know this is an easy question for you, but I think it's important for you to share it. Why is early childhood important to that 2030 vision you have for Florida?
Yeah, Vance, thanks for that. And I think just if you go back 5 years before that fateful time when Dave Lawrence had reached out and said, hey, Mark, we need you to be part of this in the Florida Chamber. I think the reality of it is when you look at the way the Florida legislature was putting budgets together and you think deep inside of an appropriations process, I think most of the world thought, okay, there's a higher education budget, there's a K-12 budget, and there's an early learning budget, and I guess they'll all just fight it out somehow, right? As if it's all equal somehow. I think once you see the brain science, and once you see cause and effect, and once you see the return on investment of an early dollar, right? I'm not going to equate it to time value of money, but there's no question that the smartest dollar we can invest is in a quality education and childcare for our earliest learners. And so when we look at 2030, to answer your question, Vance, if Florida was a nation right now, we would be the 17th largest economy in the world. So we're bigger than Saudi Arabia. Our research tells us that over the next 10 years, if we do this right, if we focus on the right 39 goals, then Florida can become the 10th largest economy in the world in 10 years. That's bigger than Mexico. We don't have time to go through all 39 goals, Vance, but I want to answer your question. Beyond the human component of this, that people matter, if you want to look at the goals, one of our goals, as you well know, is our Business Alliance for Early Learning has laid out a goal that 100% of our third graders in Florida will read at least at grade level by 2030. And as you know, and our viewers know, we're at 58% today. But in order for that to happen, we all need to support the children's movement, because Vance, you and your team have stepped up, and you're the leader of another one of our important goals, which is that 100% of our kindergartners are ready for kindergarten by 2030. And of course, that number today is 53%. So Florida is one of the best states in the country in terms of what we've done so far. But as you and I both know, we have a long way to go. And if we're going to reach our potential in Florida of creating another 1.5 million jobs in 10 years, there's no more important goal than getting early learning right, because we can't have a future workforce that's going to be the best workforce in the world if we're leaving kids behind and if we're accepting 53% and 58%. And so that's a little bit of the why this matters to us so much.
Yeah, I guess what I've always wondered is why, in a state that has been so focused on education reform, why has it taken us so long to understand that, when you're putting half of your students into the K-12 system not prepared, that you're never going to be able to reach those outcomes that you're seeking to reach, and it's gone unnoticed not unnoticed, but unaddressed for a long time. And as you know, there was a bill in the legislature this year that sought to put more quality in our VPK program, but again, we're still fighting over the battle of priorities. So getting to Bosses for Babies. So again, this has been our narrative since that fateful call with Dave and Tony. We have sought out ways to engage the business community, and we talked first about how do we engage them in the policy arena, how do we engage them in community impact, but the piece that I really feel passionate about is how are not engaging government, as you said, like more private sector focus. How are corporations able to participate in ways that support families, support children, have family-friendly business policies? Can you talk a little bit about what you're seeing across the state and what you'd like to see in Florida?
Yeah, thanks for that, Vance. And I think it's important to realize that, a lot of times conversations tend to go to, what is Congress going to do, or the president going to do, or the governor, or the legislature. And I think what we're talking about here is, we have a couple million companies in Florida, and we have in the neighborhood of about 10 to 10.5 million people who are in the workforce in Florida. So, as opposed to waiting on government to do something, the real question that, groups like SHRM and groups like the Florida Chamber of Commerce are asking ourselves is, what can companies do, right, without any action from the government whatsoever? And when we think about the policies that companies can enact that are pro-child, that are pro-family, that are pro-community, we start looking at, what kind of policies can employers put in place that are going to help families through this really difficult time, whether you're a single mom or a single dad or a family with two people working or somebody with nobody working right now. And so, we've done some survey work, Vance, and we're obviously, most of the large employers, the major employers in Florida are part of the Florida Chamber. So we ask them, what are you doing? And I was just looking at the numbers, and, one of the questions we ask is, has your organization put any measures in place to assist your staff and employees, given the lack of child care learning programs in Florida and so forth. And, what I will tell you is about 34% of our members have said yes, they've started putting policies in place to help people through this pandemic. But about 50% said that they've not, and 11% said that they were unsure. And so I think and by the way, 87% of our members have said that their employees are in fact affected negatively, by this childcare crisis that we have. Only 12% have said that they're not. So, if you want to look at are people impacted by this, almost 9 out of 10 businesses are. About a third of our members are actually putting some policies in place that they say are aimed at helping through this. About 50% have not yet done that. So what we're going to be very focused on, and we're so glad to be partnering with you on one such initiative, is how can local chambers of commerce and the Florida Chamber, how can we help get the word out that, now is the time. Let's not wait on the government to do something. What can small, medium, and large businesses do to enact their own policies right now to help their own employees and their families through this incredibly trying time coming up in the fall? So I hope that makes sense.
Absolutely. And sort of two thoughts, coming out of this pandemic with so many people working virtually, we have a 14-person office. We have restrictions because of the municipality that our office is in, that we can only have 25% of our staff in the building at any given time. And so the vast majority of our team is working virtually. And it's forced us as an organization to think about what are our necessities in order to remain as productive and effective as we can and need to be. And, part of my hope is that corporations will start to look at, what does the workplace look like? Because in many ways, me, I have 3 little girls, 9, 7, and 2. And as somebody who historically has traveled all the time, it's been really helpful for our family, for me to be able to have that flexibility of, being able to work from home, still maintaining productivity. But I think that's going to be an important conversation. So I know we only have 6 or 7 minutes left. I'd like to say, on Facebook, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat and our team will get back to you afterwards. But I just wanted to ask you one last question, Mark. Something that you have blessed under the umbrella of the Florida Chamber Foundation is the Early Learning Business Alliance. And, we started it a number of years ago with the idea of the business community having its voice in early learning. And, it's evolved like everything needs to evolve. And I think we're getting to an even better place in terms of how that group can be effective. But, what is your ultimate hope and vision for that alliance? Because it really is singular in Florida. There is no other association of companies coming together in a statewide way that are focusing explicitly on early learning. So I guess what's your hope for the Early Learning Business Alliance, and how does it tie into Bosses for Babies?
Yeah, well, thanks for that, Vance, and I appreciate that question. So I think, first of all, let's acknowledge there are already some amazing groups in Florida. Children's Movement is a perfect example. There's no reason to replicate great work that's already being done. We have the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. There's so many great organizations in Florida. What was missing, and this is when Dave Lawrence kind of hit me with a 2x4 years ago, what was missing is the business community was, writing a lot of checks to support this organization or that organization, but we had never really taken ownership of the fact that, if we can go in and make a difference, whether it's using muscle to enact better policy, or whether it's, and Vance, this is so important what I'm about to say, raising awareness, right, and creating awareness among business leaders of what's not happening in our early years, right, is something that I can't stress enough. And so, for example, going school by school around Florida and saying, hey, that school, 34% of the third graders can read at grade level. And by the way, that means there's 82 kids in that school that cannot read at grade level. Now, what's the business community and that community going to do about that problem? And Vance, I know we don't have enough time to get into the details here, but most people assume that the local school board or that politicians, or that the local superintendent would never allow there to be 60 kids or 80 kids in a school that can't read at grade level. But that, in fact, is what we have. And so what we're working on here, and I'm going to get to Bosses for Babies, but what we're working on right now is there's so much ignorance in our communities as to what matters most and what's possible. And I'm sad to say I used to be in that camp, right? Before you and Dave Lawrence and others educated me on what was actually happening, in the early years and at ground level, I didn't know either. But the beauty of the business community is once we see the problem, the business community rallies around it. And so whether it's a private sector solution like Bosses for Babies, or whether it's uniting the business community around, quality childcare, this is a movement now that you all started years ago. And our hope with the Business Alliance for Early Learning is that we can get tens of thousands of businesses in Florida understanding and aware of how important the early learning or the early years are, and that they can direct their support to organizations like yours, and that they can get their businesses in every zip code of Florida understanding what's going on in the local community and how can we use promising practices and best practices to really own our 100% of kindergartners being ready for kindergarten by 2030. So I hope that gives a sense of what we're working on.
Absolutely. And Dave and I forgive you for not being in our camp earlier, but in all seriousness, and I'll just say it again, after being in this world for more than a decade and traveling every corner of the state, as I know you have as well, Florida is a beautiful, beautiful part of this country. I think it's the most beautiful. And I think there's an opportunity for us as a state to be the national example for what this looks like. We've already been so innovative in education, but this has been the missing piece for far too long. And I would just say in closing that there will be no more important voice in this fight than the business community. And I am honored and privileged to stand alongside you. And I'm just truly grateful for everything that the Florida Chamber has done, the Florida Chamber Foundation, and really specifically your leadership, Mark, because without you, none of it would have been possible.
Well, that's awfully kind of you, and I don't believe that's true, but we've got a great team. Our board members are committed to the future of Florida, and when we have partners like the Children's Movement, my hope is more and more businesses will support you, not just at the statewide level, but they will be asking, hey, what's the Children's Movement doing in my backyard, whether it's Panama City or Miami or Fort Myers or wherever it might be. And then how can the business community rally behind the early years and the child care leaders that are helping to get it done? So, Vance, thank you so much for what you're doing. Thanks for having us today.
Of course, my friend. Have a great day.
You too.
Take care.